Gogo Wathiongo, who passed away a couple of weeks ago in his 80s, would remind us that colonialism was essentially the appropriation of intellectual freedom, agency, and voice. If this is not about filling the financing gap, as Brian is arguing, and it is more about mental liberation, it's about financial liberation, it's about sovereignty. Jackie, what would be some of the markers of sovereignty-led institutions, institutions that are grounded in their own power, and I guess, how would this show up in these global philanthropy interactions? What would be different?
Thank you, Irungu. But can I first request, we didn't give a clap to Janet, please. She made very pregnant points. And I've even written a question here for my own organization. Do the people on our street even know us? Yeah, and it's as simple as that. I remember when I moved to where I am, at least the way my mother raised me, is that when you get into a community, you go and introduce yourself. Or at least, okay, there was that, go introduce yourself, or community members would, there's a new person amongst us, we go and see them and take something for them, because that is how and where generosity started. And so when I moved to where I am now, asked a good friend of mine to bake me some banana bread, and I went and knocked on my neighbors' doors, and I said, I'm this, I do this, and I'm glad to be on this street with you. And I know that I try as much as possible to be involved in my community affairs. So when the local council chairman calls us, I am there. Because I want to be part of and embedded in my community. Why don't we do that when it comes to my organization? So it's an interesting and powerful question that you've left in my mind, Janet. And maybe that's where sovereignty lies and begins, that we must remember that at the end of the day, we are absolutely human, first and foremost. And that sometimes we can get caught up in a system that almost requires that dehumanizes us, that almost requires that you first negate and forget the very humanness of yourself in order to participate in this structure that can sometimes be very cold. It knows you as a number. Please quote your grant number when communicating to us. So I'm not Jackie that's communicating, I'm communicating as my grant number. And that becomes painful, because then it removes the human in us. And I think going back to sovereignty, or being sovereign, is saying, I am first and foremost human, period. And that is one for me. So anything that requires that I contort myself into something I am not. And human means that I am human with others. I am human in community. I don't live alone. I have often wanted and desired that, we are many organizations. If I get a grant, can I share the grant? And there are so many rules about not, re-granting is another thing, but can I share? Because will I see my neighbor organization starve, and I have, and then what? Where does that take us? It doesn't take us anywhere. So can we allow ourselves to share when I get something? That's why, again, this was supposed to be a campfire, and I had hoped in my head. Communities went out to farm, you brought the harvest and shared. We went out to hunt, we brought what we hunted and shared. Because filling my belly and my neighbor's belly is empty is not the way to be sovereign. It is actually the way to become used and used up, unfortunately. So how do we go back to some of those things that recenter solidarity? I think the other for me is just owning my yes and my no. I know that in this sector we struggle with the things we can say yes to, we struggle with the things we can say no to. And oftentimes we say yes when we really wanted to say no, and we say no when we really wanted to say yes. So for me, sovereignty is that, just owning, being able to own those two simple things, your yes and your no. And then finally, and this came to me last year, we at our office, we started this practice in COVID, and we've continued it. We take a week-long rest. It's not taken off your leave, it's not nothing, but it's just rest in order to rejuvenate. In order to then, and we do this at the end of the first half of the year, so last week of June or first week of July, and then, we take on the rest of the year. Last year, I noticed after that week of rest, looking around at my team, I noticed still tired faces. And as we were doing our check-in, the person leading the meeting that day asked us, if you had a superpower, what would it be? And I said, if I had a superpower, the thing I would do now is shut us down for the rest of the year, because you all are tired. And working with tired bodies and tired minds is not the way to do this work. It's a system that breaks us. And so I'm winding down. That to say that if I could, for me, sovereignty is, if systems need to shut down, let's shut down. Let's hibernate. Because it is in that rejuvenation that we reclaim the things that we bleed as we do this work. So those for me, the resting, the back to humanness, the solidarity, the owning our yes and our no.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Let me also invite you to appreciate the comments that are there. Maybe not winding us down, but actually winding us up. And I think in the next time we might ask you to share the email address, because a number of people I think will want to apply to work for CivSource, given the leave benefits that we've just heard. I'm definitely kind of first in line. So I'm going to ask, and just with no apology to Brian, I'm going to ask you to respond to a slightly different question, Brian. So you sit as the head of programs across Open Society Foundation. It is a foundation that is very well known for its brave leadership, particularly on issues of governance, democracy, and social justice. Given the recent changes, what are some of the conversations that are happening within the foundation that you can share that would take us down the path of, I guess, sovereignty, liberation, and disruptive programming? Are there thoughts that are emerging that perhaps we can steal and take across our organizations as well, hoping that we do not rob you of your job and then you have to apply to CivSource to also take up the leave benefits that you've just heard about?
Look, the three types of threats will take away your tax benefit status. If you are seen to have funded groups that can be characterized as terrorists, then you'll be affected, and etc. I mean, most foundations came together in the US, but Irungu, I won't waste African time talking about US fragilities. Let me answer the question I want to answer. And it's important because there's an instinctive return to the fact that as important as the US and Europe is in our spaces, that importance has always been because we are fundamentally and totally disconnected from the business of creating African philanthropies, African philanthropy ecosystem, and African resources. It's a disconnect where our governments spend more attending the royal coronation in Britain and attending conferences. If you just took that money, it's the equivalent of what we are giving groups at a national level combined as philanthropies. Right, let me explain what I mean. If Kenya takes a delegation of 100 to the UN General Assembly for 10 days or 5 days, if you compute that money at hotel rooms at $600 per day, per diem at another 300, 400, or 700 a day, that means we're spending on one person almost 1,000, 1,500 times 100. And you do this annually. What I'm suggesting, Irungu, is I don't want to have a conversation about what do we do now that the neighbor is not paying for my child's school fees. I want to have a conversation about what is it that we must change in how we interact with the system of production and reproduction of value and goods in our countries in ways that enable us not to need Brian, Kagoro, and external philanthropy. It's fundamental, because if this group doesn't have that conversation, right, this group will come, they will come into halls with philanthropies, look, help us, we're really struggling, people are losing jobs, and philanthropies will run around, they'll piece together money to make sure that some groups are saved. Most of these groups, Irungu, are urban-based. No. Let me talk about what it is. They are urban-based, middle-class people, speak good French, good English, wear suits, we went to the same schools. So in essence, we are saving our godchildren. We're not saving justice as a value or a sector in society. We are not saving peace as a value in our society. So I'm asking us to have a fundamental conversation, my brother. A fundamental, I wouldn't ask Evans. I told him, Evans, I don't waste time. I don't do it within open society, and my colleagues are here, they'll tell you, I have no time to be discussing, because the sovereignty I am talking about essentially means within this room, the amount we will spend in the next 3 days, as important as it is for us to talk, would be a significant investment if we said, okay, we're going to forego, just pretend we're fasting 2 meals a day for the next 3 days, and then put that money in a little kitty, and then ask you, Irungu or Jackie, invest this money. There is an intellectual laziness in the middle class in this sector. In fact, there is a treacherous nature that we have all accustomed. We have good salaries, we have good, the ones who are at the coffers, the last mile organizations, Irungu, are not the ones that get support. They did not even qualify for US aid support. So the people most affected are the people who are sitting at the core. This is a middle class elite conversation about the world has changed. For who? For us as elites. The poor are still in the condition they were in. Why? Because of structural adjustment program, Irungu. Because when the global economic crisis happened in 2008, 2010, they were pushed further down. And when COVID came, they were pushed even further down. And so the crisis we have now is not a recent crisis. It's a cumulative crisis of a system that's been in crisis, and we have been the palliatives, we have been the, what you call, placebos for poor people, saving the system its final exposure and preventing it from implosion. That's why our people have no aspiration to own the wealth in their own country. They have an aspiration to hold their governments to account so that they don't take bribes for giving away their natural resources. So even our struggles for ethics are based on a capitulation that says we have accepted we'll never own. Would like others to come and own, recolonize us, just you do it, bring a foreign firm and a foreign accounting firm, it will work for us. And philanthropy operating in this context must actually answer the question. The immiseration of Africans is based on their dispossession of land, Irungu. You have been fighting land struggles. They're being dispossessed, not just by corrupt politicians, but supposedly sometimes under green energy investments. Right? And that's why I am here. I didn't come to listen to African philanthropists say, hey, we're going to be extinct because our rich sugar daddies and sugar mummies are also in crisis. No, my comrades, no. That's not why we are here. We are here to author liberation. And it starts off by saying, now that Santa Claus is not coming, what do we do for Christmas?
Janet, please go in any direction after that intervention. Whatever you say will be perfect.
Honestly speaking from my heart, and I'm actually writing about this, I think one of the biggest things we must do is to change that mindset. And I'm a coach, and I know what it is to go through therapy. And I've been feeling like we NGOs need to go through therapy so that we recover from what Brian is talking about. Do you understand what I mean? Do you know what therapy means? Therapy means you you get to a point of acknowledging what went wrong. You know where you are, and then you actually get convinced in your head. That's why it begins with the mind. You can't change things unless your mind is convinced something is wrong. And as the leader of the organization, you make sure you actually have that very honest conversation within your team. I believe we start with our teams, the groups and people we are with every day. We make sure our boards understand that we have to work differently. We have to make decisions about who we are. If we have given up our core work because of accepting money, is that something we should continue to do? If we have accepted that there's something wrong, if we have accepted there's something wrong, then surely, goodness, we have to change. And if it doesn't begin with a conviction in the mind, then I don't know where it begins. So the more I see things happening in the sector, the more I'm convinced that to recover, we have to, you know, the way you go back to the very beginning. When did I lose it? And if I have lost it, of course, anybody can come back. But you need to be convinced and then begin to act differently, but you can't act the same and say, you know, things are. So I believe changing the mindset, changing our way of doing business is not, because wherever you have an organization, you are running an organization, you have to begin where you are. If you are not convinced that there's something wrong, then of course you're not going to convince anybody. You know, so I really think there's room for us to begin to be different. There's a big need for us to work together, act together. So of course, the more of us are convinced about this, it becomes easier. I believe one of the reasons why the government is able to shoot down one person is because one person stands up, you know, as advocating for certain changes. But when we work collectively, and I really like the way EAPN has tried to mobilize us to, you know, to be able to understand these things and to move, and everybody begin to raise resources differently, we'll stand by something. You have to stand by something. It will not just be a job. If it means we go through a cut because we don't like bad money, let's call it by a bad money. I mean, let's call it by its name. It's bad. We don't want it. If it changes who we are, our DNA, let's forget it. Let's now speak to anyone giving us money, whether locally or wherever. Let's put our case out of conviction, not just to accept anything that sits on the table.
Thank you very much, Janet. Please appreciate that response. And then allow me to come to Jackie as the last intervention as we are getting close to the food burning. Can you smell the food burning a bit? Can you smell it a little bit? Or it's just my imagination? Okay, we're going to take another 3 minutes, then we're moving to the back. This is just to create a bit of pressure. Jackie, let me just do the same thing I did with Janet, which is, where would you like to leave this conversation for now?
Thank you. Okay, this is where I want to land the thoughts in my head. And Brian and Janet, thank you for your comments. In the morning plenary the session that we began after the main plenary, I asked the group, what is your why? Why are you in this work? What is that thing that sparked your heart, that touched you, and you said, this is the work I must be doing? And of course, because of time, we didn't have the opportunity to come back to say, what did your neighbor say? But I'm almost certain none of us said it was money that moved us. And so if it isn't money that moves us, yes, money is important, absolutely. We're not even saying that by any stretch of the imagination. Because even that money that Brian says we earn, we don't earn only for ourselves. We are multiplying it because of the dependencies that are all around us all the time, right? Up and down. So it's not even money that we get to keep in order to grow rich. So, but if our why had nothing to do with money, how do we, as Janet has said, return to that why, to that belief that because I know why I'm in this, I will survive regardless. Not just me, the work that I am doing is important enough to survive whether or not we have money, and find those ways. That's the constant question on my mind right now. If we had no grant, absolutely, if we had no money, would we still do this work? And I think each of us needs to answer that for ourselves. And if it is a yes, then lean in and lean hard because our ultimate aim, I hope, and this is my second point, is justice. Because that is what we desired at the core, that the world cannot be where it is, otherwise we will all die. And so if justice is our cry, is our why, then let's lean into that even harder, and our belief will make a way. Thank you so much.
Allow me to ask you a question because
Sure.
because
Do you want us to change seats?
No, stay there.
We can go that.
I need you to take a left position.
Okay. I'm on the left already. But,
So Irungu,
sure.
you've worked in development and philanthropy for a long time. Two questions. How do we develop a leadership that sees the future, appreciates the past, and makes changes in the present? First question. Second question, how do you and I address the question of, so the first one is about leadership, the question of the next generation. Their conception of institutions is not the same as yours and mine historically. I think we're seeing it with Gen Zs, we're seeing it with others. If you had, what did Jackie say? If you had a superpower, whatever it is that, I adopt Jackie's language, right? She's more intelligent than I am. If you were to create an Pan-African philanthropic institution of the future, what might be some of its characteristics? I know the values, but what might it look like? Paint a mental picture for us.
So it's about 35 years since I joined this sector. I came into the sector at the age of 25. I had come out of university. I was looking to become a lecturer, but unfortunately, the government of the day had killed the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the universities were closed for about 8 months. So I applied to every university, couldn't get in. And then Willie Mutunga at the time said to me, why don't you look at NGOs as a place to find a place to organize? And I asked him what was an NGO, and he said it's a non-governmental organization. And I remember in that period, this is 1991, thinking how stupid that name was. And who calls themselves anything on the basis of what they're not, right? Now, it is almost, let me jump forward a little bit. About 8 years later, a man by the name of Salil Shetty hunted me very hard. This time, Janet was working with ActionAid. I was doing essentially, I guess, a combination of adult education, civic education, gender training, and trying to stop the clashes that were taking place in the part of the country. And he said to me, listen, I have the right job for you. It's the policy research manager for ActionAid. And literally, the man did not take no for an answer. One of the things that strikes me about how do you build leadership that is rooted in the past is organizing in the present with a vision for the future, is how important an understanding of people's history is, right? And the relationship between, I guess, colonialism, neocolonialism, and the current environment, which I think is actually a return to free trade imperialism. I think we have gone back 100 years in some ways, right? And then I could go on for longer, but I think dinner is coming. So I think one of the things that we have to go back to is political education. We have to get people to discuss issues politically, and I'm not talking about party politics. I'm talking about the kind of conversations that many of us had, when we came into this sector, where we looked at things like, for example, Pan-Africanism. We looked at issues around class. We looked at issues around intersectionality of gender. We now, of course, are looking at issues of sexual orientation and gender identity. We also need to look at issues of rural-urban tensions. And I think the one that is increasingly more interesting to me is the intergenerational battle for the spaces in which we operate, right? So I think that would be one way of responding. The second question, I think, relates to the issue that you've generated. I have had such an interesting time over the last 1 year. Consider this, and I work primarily on Kenya, so I apologize for a very Kenyan perspective. You know, there were 6 million Kenyan youth who were eligible to vote in the 2022 election. And they neither chose to get out of bed nor to go vote in an election that was decided by roughly about 230,000 votes. 6 million young people did not participate. 230,000 votes is what it took for the Electoral Commission, and this of course is debatable. Kenyan elections are never clear-cut, right? But let's just go with the announcement that was made, despite the fact that 3 out of the 7 electoral commissioners disputed those figures. These young people didn't come out to vote. 1 year later, roughly, or is it? Yeah, about 18 months later, hundreds of thousands of people, mostly young people, occupy the streets across probably about 32 to 35 counties out of the 47, right? There were 4 protests in Kenya last year, every day, for the entire year. It's about 1,800 protests. Most of them were organized by young people. Not all of them were to do with the finance bill. Not all of them were to do with stopping femicide. But those 2 issues were probably the pivot issues for young people in Kenya last year. Now, I could go on and talk about kind of the concerns, but what I was struck by was just how innovative, how agile, and how direct the Gen Z movement were. Right? Let me give you a couple of examples. They declared that they were going to march on Parliament 5 days before. There was a week of rage. I know reliably that there was no risk assessment, no fire drill even, that was done in Parliament ahead of the date that this Gen Z said they were going to occupy Parliament. Nobody bothered to do a fire drill. Nobody bothered to ask the MPs, if you see these people coming and you think it's getting out of hand, this is how you leave the building. The arrogance of the political class was almost palpable. Until the gates and the fences came down, they did not realize how fragile the system that they had created was. One example. The second thing that I was really kind of appreciative was the ruling class or the political class responded by saying, let us have dialogue. We need multi-sectoral dialogues. Please come to State House. We'll set up 6 different work streams. We'll have some labs. This sounds a bit familiar? Okay, just to put yourselves in that space a little bit. And the youth said, listen, we don't want to dialogue with you. We don't want to have conversations. We just want you to do your job. And then a group of people started reaching out to some of us who were providing protection for the protesters, legal advice, representation. We were supporting doctors to provide emergency medical care in the streets, wherever they were. And they reached out to us and said, please tell these young people to form a leadership structure. And that conversation took 10 hours, right, in a very secretive place of a number of organizations. And we realized that actually what we were trying to impose on them was a leadership structure that A, was very dangerous for them, but secondly, was an old, outdated model of organizing. They did not have a president or a chief executive. They needed a cabinet to make this decision, or a central committee. And we realized two things. One is the moment they declare who the leaders are, money would flow from our taxes to buy them off. The ones who refused would be killed or arrested. So we took a decision that the concept of a leaderless movement was actually the contribution that the Gen Z were giving us. That actually, for organizations like Amnesty, the Law Society of Kenya, the Defenders Coalition, that they needed to embrace this idea that actually it is not important for charismatic leaders or even proficient leaders to lead a social uprising. Maybe, is that a couple of suggestions? Okay.
I'm going to ask Janet and Jack, how do we build power in this ecosystem? From a feminist perspective, from a community whatever perspective you want. So people are talking about building power. How do you build power to create not just new institutions, new imaginations, new knowledge, new wealth, and etc.? If you were to say, hey, I've been here, I've done that, I came back with a t-shirt and a sari, what would it look like?
Injustice against one, right, is injustice against all of us. And unless we leapfrog our minds to appreciate that none of us is safe. The other one that came to mind is lean on me when you're not strong. And isn't that what we must do? So in this time when there's shaking, who are we leaning on? Is it leaning on each other or still trying to lean on the system that anyway is falling, and in which case you will also fall, right? So how do we lean in and lean on each other? For me, that is what power building is about. Lean on me when you're not strong, because one day I too will need your shoulder. And so in leaning together, we are doing this together, but also none of us is safe. None people, I tell you, until all of us are. So we're in this together, whether we want to or not, whether we would like it or not, whether we like each other or not. So how do we contend with that and build together?
I think we can see, and I feel there's something young folks offer that we don't have, you know. As years go by, they actually become, and I see it even in my home, you know. And so there are things I just won't struggle with. I'm like, no, you guys just do this, you know. You do it better than me. Why should I do it? Just go and tell me, call me when you need me, you know, type of thing. And I think when I think about leadership, I think we have to be intentional in our organizations in making sure that intergenerational growth and continuity is happening intentionally, not by accident. The level of exposure, you know, bringing them on board, mentoring, just creating opportunities, opening up opportunities, not thinking of ourselves as dominant. I think the more we do that, the more we lose out. You know, because as you say, I mean, I believe the story, Irungu, you gave, because I witnessed it myself, you know. Salil having faith in you as a below 30 person, seeing your potential. And I'm even willing to risk this budget. Just go, run with it, you know. And I think we have opportunities like those in our organizations. And of course, when I look at the sector myself, you know, seeing many people are on board, I just think it's us to keep that mentorship growing people who are working from conviction, and, you know, making sure that continuity is happening, you know. And of course, I also think there's a big room for us to be part of networks that are standing for what we are talking about. I sometimes feel sorry when I think about the move to create, you know, there's a time we were really pushing for the government to create a more conducive environment for the kind of, you know, the legal framework that would enable us to, you know, to kind of do some things in a much better environment. And I think sometimes we drop the ball. But if we act together and push, you know, these things will happen. So I think there's a big role for networks that are coherent, so creating spaces so that we don't miss out to join in growing the movement. That's a word I was looking for. a movement. It's hard to, the reason the Gen Z succeeded is because they were in Eldoret, they were in Mombasa, they were in Nairobi, they were everywhere. You know, so growing big numbers for conviction. So let's not hide back in our cocoons in our organizations and hope we can be successful alone. Nobody has ever been successful alone. If you are convinced about something, why not bring others on board? As we learn these things, let's bring others on board and let's grow across generations. And we will become a force, a credible group to, you know, but we must be credible. I think when some of us let us down by the reputations we create because they can see we are not acting like we believe what we are talking about, then that's a disservice to the group. So we must keep our integrity, not only as organizations, but as a sector.
My job now is to just basically thank you all and also to just direct you towards the meals.